Hello, welcome to the second episode of our case studies webinar series. We had a great conversation with Susan Leedy with Mods for Quads on how to launch a new nonprofit. And today we're going to talk about how to scale an existing nonprofit. And we're going to be really focused on what does fundraising look like for an organization which already has baseline foundational funding, but is going to be introducing a whole new product or service into the mix. And specifically, we're going to be talking with Annalise from Yampa Mountain High School, Colorado River BOCES, which is about to launch a career center. And all the money that's going to be required to support this career center has to come from soft funds, that they're not going to be able to use existing foundational funds. But again, we have with us Lisa Raleigh, who comes to us with significant experience, both in the public and private sector. I mentioned in the last program about her work with two anchor businesses, Backbone Media and Big Stone Publishing. And of course, her 9 years at the helm of Colorado Rocky Mountain School's development, and did substantial fundraising for that school. So this is very much in her wheelhouse to talk about how to help a school. But again, we're trying to cast a broader lens on what does it mean for that nonprofit that's established to scale with new programs, new ideas. There's definitely it's a different set of things to think about. And then of course, we're lucky to have Chris Carroll with us, our Small Business Development Counsel, to provide the business lens on what are those business skills that could be helpful for a nonprofit looking to scale to the next level. So on that note, Lisa, maybe we could just start off by talking about what are the considerations for an established nonprofit who is looking to launch a new product, a new service. What do they need to think about?
It's a great question, and I think every nonprofit is unique in how the mothership is comprised and funded. And so I think in Yampa, you've got a school that's in the public school system that has, and Mike, you can speak to that, federal and state funding revenue per pupil. But the program they're looking at launching, this career and technical center, is going to fall outside of all that funding. And so all of a sudden they have a new baby nonprofit on their hands where they've got to really understand what's that annual budget going to look like. And in the absence of any revenue or federal or state education funding, what is the private sector going to look like for them? And where are the granting opportunities? Where are the individual donors? And in the case of a career center, where are some corporate partners and sponsors, not only to work collaboratively with the kids, but also to provide funding because it's the right thing to do to invest in our future workforce. So in this particular case, I think it's full of incredibly unique opportunity. Generally speaking, if you've got a nonprofit and you have a traditional understanding of your funding and you want to launch above and beyond, you've got to be really careful that you don't cannibalize your existing funding. And as you pointed out in our pre-conversation, that's not even an option in this case because the Yampa funding is designated and specific in its educational component. So it's going to be imagining new funding sources. And then I think the other thing you always have to be careful of is this restricted funding piece. When you launch a new program within a nonprofit and you go out exclusively funding for that, you have to make sure that that money matches with those budget expenditures because you are locking yourself into that space. And so for a lot of organizations, they've got to make sure they get that number right and they don't over fundraise unless they're willing to put it in reserves because it is, legally allocated to the cause that you went out after.
That's great information. I think, and to know that most schools are in this 80 to 90% funding model that comes from the state based on this math formula per student. I think in Colorado, it's around $5,000 to $6,000 per student. And certainly Yampa and the Colorado River BOCES gets the bulk of their funding from that situation, but it's never enough, right? It's never enough for any school. And I think in Yampa, and Annalise can maybe confirm this later, but probably 15%, it sounds like, comes from grants and donations. And my understanding, not a whole lot from donations. So it sounds like a lot of the wisdom you have on going after, the philanthropic side is going to be incredibly valuable. But I'm kind of curious, with an organization that's been around for like 4 decades, like doing great work and figuring it out. And yes, they have this new program, which is absolutely going to be essential to their growth, and it's going to be this valuable resource, even with all their metrics and their success. Like, how do you launch a new project like that when you know that none of your existing funding can be used?
Well, the huge advantage, I think, in this scenario versus our first one, which is a startup, from the ground, is there's incredible brand reputation and integrity here. And having that history and legacy in this valley and in beyond already gives you a tremendous amount of credibility. So I think the challenges lie in really defining a budget, and you're basically launching a new arm of a business. And I think when we get to Chris, he can speak a little bit to that. So many of the things we talked about in our first series comes into play here. You need a really solid strategic plan for this career center. You need a tight budget. You need a case for support that you can readily articulate. And you need to be really bold and fearless in fundraising for this one, because to your point, it's going to be 100% philanthropic. But the huge, huge advantage is that established, incredibly powerful organization that most people in this valley know about. And that's really going to be a friend when these guys go out and begin that fundraising initiative.
I wonder if there are any lessons you could share from your time with CRMS. I would imagine a private school setting certainly has access to more larger donors, and that's a part of that game. Like, they have to sort of build that into their business model from an early stage to go after those funds. But for a public school that has been dependent on public funds for so long, how do they begin to think like a private school? Like, what are some of the strongest lessons from that private school setting that could be taken into this endeavor?
It's a great question, and I'll just give some context to how an independent private school works. The majority of the funds do come from tuition, but there is an annual fund every year where you fund 10 to 15% of the budget through charitable contributions. And so this idea, even though you have parents paying for an education in the independent school landscape, it's very common, especially with multi-generational families that have done independent schools before, that the reason independent schools can offer the extraordinary programming and the dedicated teachers that oftentimes spend their whole lives in those settings is through that philanthropic piece. Likewise, both my daughters went to Ross Montessori, and it's a state charter, and it too is eligible, for different, is the term PPR, do I have that? The per pupil fund, but they too have to fundraise the balance, right? If you want to have arts programs and outdoor programs and things that are outside of these tight funding budgets, you're going to do that through philanthropy in your community. And so at Ross, a lot of the the parents, they worked on annual fund committees, and they were tasked with raising a couple $100,000 a year, and they would reach out to granting entities and also to really philanthropic people who just believe in educational choice in the valley. So I think the model is very known and understood, and just the public school system, I mean, with COVID and you see the upcoming budget cuts, this is such a common practice for schools to step in and fundraise the balance. Or you even end up with educational foundations like in Basalt and Aspen that do that to help their own school systems. So you are not in a strange territory. And I think I would even say you're in a pretty fortunate one. When we talk to Annalise and we learn a little bit more about the different demographics they serve and the work that they're doing, there's a lot of interest in funding and helping students that maybe come from tougher economic circumstances or first gen, or they're at risk for other reasons. There's a huge interest in this valley in supporting and funding their success. And I believe a career center is going to hit the sweet spot, not only of individual donors, but a lot of the granting opportunities that are local and statewide in particular. So I think it's a pretty exciting endeavor that, if set up properly, will be really well received on the philanthropic front.
Is there, even though this conversation is really focused on Yampa and the BOCES and really what a school needs to be thoughtful about, I want to keep in mind that the conversation is still about what does an established nonprofit do to sort of launch their program, a new program, or just launch their enterprise to the next level? Are there are there lessons, are there consistent best practices that you think translate across the board? I mean, schools are a bit of an outlier, but if we're talking about schools and established nonprofits, are there very specific things that you see in sort of more standard nonprofit world that could be useful for a school launching new programs?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have a general answer because everyone's really unique. Someone may be providing a service and they go, gosh, with more funding, we could provide 10 times as much service and there's a demand there. Someone else might be doing similar to what we're seeing here with Yampa, where they're like, hey, we see an opportunity to provide a completely unique and new service above and beyond what we're currently doing. So I think a lot of the principles we talked about in our first session are really relevant here. Is there a need for what it is you're interested in providing or scaling up to? So that's question A. Question B is, are there enough people or entities out there interested in funding and supporting this? So regardless of what you're looking at doing, there's other people in similar spaces. And one thing I didn't say in the previous session that I want to say now, I really believe fundraising comes from a place of abundance. It's not a competitive space. If there's a need, if you're serving a certain community and you've got like in the case of just the Career Center, you see a need and an opportunity to really help elevate and move people forward, and you feel like it's not being met in this valley, but there's other similar type organizations, that's okay, because that suggests the need is great enough and the support is great enough. So I always believe in an abundant mindset, never a competitive one around this. But yeah, you've got to have a solid business model. It has to make business sense. The budget's got to make sense and the funding has to make sense. And I think Mike in our third session will talk a little bit about this, but you've got to be able to win on paper whatever it is you're setting out to do. So if your supplemental new program you want to bring online is going to cost $200,000 and you can't cannibalize any of your existing funding, in the case of a traditional nonprofit, they might be able to go to individual donors and granting entities and ask them to go above and beyond. And that's like what you see in a capital campaign. We did a huge capital campaign at CRMS, but we never wanted it to be at the expense of the annual giving, because you still need the annual giving for the operating budget. So launching a new program is that same mindset. If you've got independent funders that are in a position to give more, you've got to talk to them that way and kind of protect the original investment and invite them to join you in this new investment. But it's done all the time, because an established nonprofit, much like the case of Yampa or any other example, they have the benefit of they already have a base, and they already have a donor base, and they have a reputation to operate from. And I think those are real assets when you look at expanding programming.
The last episode, we talked about storytelling and how that's such a critical piece. But what we didn't talk about is how data is such an important part of that story. And I imagine as these nonprofits get larger and have that proof of concept, data becomes even more important. But curious, how do you tell the story when you've definitely got data to share, but you really don't have data around the new concept? How does data play into the storytelling?
Yeah, and I think let's use this example so I can be more specific than generic, but I think it applies anywhere. You've got the data of the original organization. You've got the impact, you've got measurable impact. You're able to speak to the demographic that you're serving, and you've got this parallel data because you've been in this space. I think then in the case of like even a career center, this is not the first career center on the planet. So I think being able to tell the story by looking at other places, other models, and just being able to show an impact. So your storytelling is partially based on your history and partially aspirational. But once again, you're coming from a place of credibility if you have a strong reputation. And I think people will be more generous with you in that space, both generous in assumption and generous in giving, if they know your integrity and your work and your results in your primary space. It's easier to come from this space, in my opinion, than a straight up startup.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's transition and introduce Annalise, who's been with Yampa Mountain High School and the Colorado River BOCES for several years now, wearing a number of different hats. And I think I've certainly been grateful to see how Annalise works. She's one of those rare individuals that is not only capable of wearing many different hats, but wears them all quite well. Maybe, Annalise, you can give us a brief snapshot of some things that you do under the Yampa BOCES roof, but also maybe then speak directly to this career center. My understanding is as Yampa has evolved, it's become clear that this at-risk student population, which typically doesn't go to college, yeah, sure, there's a handful of kids, that there's really been a need for quite some time to develop clear career pathways, and that this career center would offer these kids a chance to sort of get into the workforce sooner than later, get into a variety of internships, traditional, and almost like rethinking vocational education, that back in the day when plumbing and automotive was a big part of vocational ed. Now you can layer in technology, product innovation, renewable energy. There's a lot of great careers out there that you could get started in with just like a 6 to 12 month training program. But I guess on that note, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing at Yampa, and then about the vision of the Career Center.
Sure. So I've been at Yampa for about 9 years now. I'm a special education teacher by license. And I started in one of the programs at Yampa, which is a self-contained classroom, a special education classroom. And through my transitions, I currently am a teacher and student advisor for our dropout prevention program specifically. So Yampa has 4 programs. They have their alternative high school, their general alternative high school. They have a teen parenting program, which also has an infant and toddler room and services teen parents. The self-contained classroom that is really an arm of that Colorado River BOCES piece. And then the dropout prevention program. So most of the students that I work directly with have already dropped out of school once, and I've pulled them back into the school to figure out a way for them to graduate, because we know that they have much better success in life with a high school diploma than without a high school diploma. The population that we serve in particular is not always that population that we see going off to the 4-year colleges or even the 2-year college to get an associate's degree to then move on. Most of them are already part of the workforce while they're in high school. There's a need for many of our students to help contribute to their families. And so being able to provide an opportunity for them to learn a trade while in high school is a pretty phenomenal opportunity, and something that I'm fairly passionate about myself. I am in the process of getting an educational specialist degree, giving myself a principal's license and a SPED director's administrator's license. And through that process, one of the things that I've become quite aware of is my passion for this vocational technical education that is lacking, not necessarily just in our community, but all over the country. And so I think that the career center that we are talking about opening would be state of the art and a model for lots of different communities to look at as a way to better serve the student populations that aren't destined to go to college.
Nice, thank you, Annalise. Lisa, jump in, and how does Annalise tell this story? How does she engage that donor around, galvanize donors around this idea?
Yeah, Annalise, that was such a beautiful explanation. I think the story's going to tell itself. You guys are doing such great work, and I think, having met you and Sierra and just the dedicated people at Yampa, who's ever on the front line of telling this story and advocating for funding, I think is going to be met with tremendous success because of the passion, authenticity, and the incredible work you're doing, right here in our own valley. So I think the challenge and the opportunity is going to be to really, whoever is the executive director of this center is going to have to come to it with a huge fiscal mindset and recognize, much like we were talking in the earlier session, that person is the CEO of this center, and they've got to wake up every day imagining how to fund it, and once the budget is in place, to have a really bold, aggressive plan and be very creative and thoughtful in who the funding sources are. Without a doubt, in this valley, we're so fortunate. There's a lot of philanthropy here, hence there's a lot of nonprofits. Tons of granting opportunities right in our own backyard, and this will fall in the sweet spot of many. Also a lot of state opportunities, and I'm sure in this case could actually easily move into federal. So I think the granting side of things, I think the individual donor and or their family foundation is another huge space. And then I also think these corporate partners, because when you start talking about workforce, and because we have so many amazing organizations and companies in this valley that are really philanthropic in their backyard, this is a no-brainer lineup. So a highly strategic person treating this business with a real philanthropic lens, I think we'll have no problem telling this amazing, impactful story. Because the story, I mean, just listening to Annalise's explanation right there, like moves me. The story is beautiful.
Thanks.
Annalise, what are some of your questions?
Well, I guess the biggest question that I have is, I've heard you mention like a baby nonprofit. So when going to get, corporate sponsorships and or partners, are we creating a separate nonprofit for this career center, or is it a program within Yampa Mountain High School? Because does that make a difference when getting those grant monies?
Not on the asking end. It's going to make a difference on the internal end. So that'll be between you guys, your current governance, and however the Career Center fits legally into your construct. But in terms of reaching out to entities, no. I mean, Mike, I'm assuming, knowing very little about Yampa's structure, that this is a charitable contribution to whomever makes it.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, and I think the even more complicated question is being pretty bold and fearless in that space. Like, let's just talk about business sponsorship in this valley. There are a lot of really generous companies. The banks come to mind. I mean, Alpine and First Bank alone, just here in Carbondale, they are so incredibly committed to investing in this committee or in this valley up and down. But it's got to be timely, it's got to be professional, you've got to be on it, and so I think back to this business model, and I think Chris will speak to this, the more tightly you run this center as a business, and the more professionally you speak to people about this philanthropic investment and the impact, and make a really strong case for support. I think when it comes to corporate partners, and I'm using corporate for any business, someone might be small and may not view themselves as a corporate partner, but a business partner. I always think first, is there a return on their investment? Because I want to be really thoughtful to the businesses in this valley, and I'm so appreciative of their philanthropic support, but I also want to try to give them a return. So you guys might think really thoughtfully. You might create different sponsorship levels, and you may actually have some title sponsors that get recognition wherever you go. You might even have a naming right on that center. You might find someone to underwrite it, and you would have to decide what that level is. Someone makes a $50,000 a year contribution or $100,000 a year. Maybe it's there. I mean, I know it's held in Yampa, but much like you see up at CMC, they've got some beautiful buildings that were brought by really generous individuals and organizations, and those building names reflect that. And that's a way that the organization can say thank you and show the community that support.
Lisa, I'm curious too. You've given me and so many people great advice on the art of the story, and how it's not about leading necessarily with this great testimonial or all this data, but it's more about asking questions and trying to ascertain philanthropic philosophy. Could you speak to that process? Because that was a game changer for me, and I'm sure Annalise would benefit from that advice.
Yeah, it's called discovery. And Annalise and I were joking. She actually has a background in nonprofit management, and I don't. I kind of ended up in this space when I was at CRMS and just learned how much I loved it. But I'm a newcomer also to just sort of the practices and the vernacular. But what I learned early on was when you're sitting down with someone philanthropic or a granting entity or a business, it's not you going in and hard selling them on what it is you have. It's you setting up a meeting that's really transparent up front. I'm a huge fan of, I don't want to find myself in a conversation where I haven't let the person across from me know where we're headed. So I love reaching out and emailing people and using this type of language to say, hey, I'd love to catch up. I'd love to check in. I'd love to see how you're doing, particularly in light of COVID. I think anyone doing anything in the next year, you're always going to lead with this COVID piece because it's such a unique set of circumstances that everybody has kind of fallen into. And then I think you segue and you say, plus I'd love to share something I'm up to right now. I'd love to hear if you're interested. And if there's synergy, I'd love to ask you to consider joining us. If that communication is sent out, so if you're talking to Alpine Bank and you send that over to Helene, she knows exactly why you're meeting. If you send that over to someone that you have reason to believe might be an individual supporter in this space, they know exactly why. And then you have a beautiful conversation. You sit down and you ask questions and you listen and you learn and you find out what people or organizations care about. And then you share what you're up to. And on behalf of the constituents you're serving, like Mike and I have talked a lot about this, a lot of people think asking for money is a really kind of terrifying space, but I view it so differently now. It's just the marrying of people and projects that share the same synergy. So it's just the art of discovery and really understanding people and what they care about. And if appropriate and there's an alignment, yeah, be bold and fearless and ask for what those kids need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Annalise, maybe a couple more questions, and then I want to rope Chris into the conversation.
I don't know, Mike, exactly what questions you need me to ask. I agree a lot with what Lisa's saying and what she's talking about. That discovery piece is huge. And, I know for us as we're going out, that we can't take it personally, like it really is part of that discovery piece.
I wonder about follow-up. I know that, like, what do you do now at the school for people who are either, whether you're getting grants or even if it's donations, what kind of follow-up does Yampa or the FOCES do to just keep those relationships engaged? So it's not like a one and done. And I know Lisa's got some insights in that once you engage a donor, whether it's an organization or an individual, it's pretty critical to maintain that relationship. And there's kind of an art to maintain that relationship. And I'm curious.
Sure, I think that, generally speaking, I think that Yampa is pretty traditional in, the thank you cards and the follow through with pictures or explanations of what was done with the monies that we received, or how those monies actually benefited the students. And then at the end of the year during graduation, we always have a big thank you to anybody who has partnered with us or contributed to us in some way. But, I'm not aware of or think that we do any sort of as a volunteer coordinator, we don't do like a volunteer appreciation banquet or a donor appreciation banquet. And we don't have any big fundraisers. I mean, we have had a couple of fundraisers in the past, but nothing that has really supported the greater community as like a gala or a big event along those lines.
That was my concern, is that for a nonprofit that's launching and moving into this new space, this career center that's going to depend heavily on organizations and individuals donating, what does it mean to manage those relationships long term so you can go back to those people again and again? And maybe Lisa, you could speak to that, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that my question goes along with that. I have an understanding of us creating a capital campaign, to like start off our nonprofit or to get this career center started. But then how do we go about like selling it long term and maintaining, like when we're asking for those donations, are we asking for a multi-year contribution for sustainability purposes?
Yeah, those are both great questions and at the heart of development. So let me speak to stewardship first, and then let's talk about kind of the launching of the center versus the ongoing operating of the center. I am such a fan of leading with the stewardship program for any nonprofit organization. And it doesn't really have to be big public, celebrations. Yeah, a lot of Up Valley nonprofits do that, and it fits their personality and tone, and it fits their donor base. But I think just imagine yourself as an individual donor anywhere. You want to know your gift mattered. You want to know it was important to the organization, and you want to feel appreciated. And that doesn't happen organically in a busy outfit. So let's just imagine a day in the life of Yampa launching the Career Center. People are working, morning, noon, and night. They're going in every direction. And so you've got to create a really thoughtful, intentional stewardship plan, and you need to execute it. Like, you need to build it into your to-do list like you would just like asking for money. You need to make sure you're thanking people for money. And I do a lot of work with my clients on this front, because there's some pretty simple practices. The second you receive a gift from any entity, you pick up the phone and you call them. Because if you want to make someone feel incredibly valued, so let's imagine that there's an online fundraising component to this center, and you either do some crowd funding, or you have a email drive around making a contribution through your website. If you want to make someone feel really valued, and you catch them in the moment of giving, because it's a proven fact you have an endorphin high when you give. And if you're acknowledged while you're feeling that, that just settles in so much better as a donor. You're like, wow, they noticed and they called me right away. Holy cow, that feels really good. If you don't do that, if I make a gift, and by the way, online giving, the minute I make that gift, I know you got pinged, right? That's how that works. And I'm like, if I don't hear from you day 1, day 2, day 3, I'm almost starting to develop some animosity now, right? My feel-good moment, my endorphin high, went to something that's now starting to annoy me. So if you can catch people in the moment. Secondly, never sit on tax letters. I think a lot of organizations feel like, well, I want to wait and generate those when I can write a really thoughtful note. And I'm like, okay, a note on a tax letter is a nice touch, but that's really not stewardship. You owe those people that tax letter in a very timely manner, because they need that for part of their, filing. And if you don't send it, it will stay on their mind, and they'll be like, where is that tax letter? And then I'm a big fan of stewarding people throughout the year very intentionally. And, development is not a democracy. You definitely steward larger givers differently than you do a participation giver. You want to make sure everybody feels highly valued. But when you have larger givers, you need a very thoughtful strategic plan all year long that checks in with them and reminds them how important they are to you. And that is your best friend, because when you go to ask for money again, to your second point of annual giving, you want to have done such a nice job during the year that you're psyched to ask again and they're psyched to give again. That was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but stewardship is one that's super important to me, and I've helped clients create pretty detailed plans.
Yeah, that's cool.
Annalise, your question was great. Yeah, so, I don't know if capital campaign is the right word, because part of what you're doing is developing new programming. So, a capital campaign typically involves facilities are being built, like infrastructure is being built, and someone is funding infrastructure. Not knowing how the center, where it's going to live and operate, and if it's going to take place in existing buildings that other, partner organizations have. But yeah, you have this launch year, you have this inaugural year, right, where you're getting something off the ground. And there'll be a lot of excitement and enthusiasm around that. But I would argue, if you steward those donors very well, those early lead donors that make significant contributions, then before the year is over, you then approach them and talk to them like, listen, thank you so much for getting us off the ground. We could have never done this without you. Now, can we talk about the ongoing sustainability? We'd love to invite you and have you as a partner. And your multi-year question's brilliant. People have legacy organizations, or I don't mean legacy in plan giving. I mean, like visionary societies, people that just say, yeah, I'll give you $1,000 every year for the next 3 years or the next 5 years. And you kind of build that in, and that makes it much easier as long as you're stewarding them. You're not having to start over every single year to meet your budgetary needs.
Nice. Chris, this would be a great time to sort of weigh in. I think we've seen real value in sort of bringing the business lens into play. And Chris, I know we spoke a lot about lean canvas model as sort of a great tool for those early stage nonprofits. But it feels like for Annalise and the Career Center that go-to-market strategies might be more appropriate. Maybe you could speak to some of the tools that you use with the businesses that you coach that are kind of that next phase, and they're actually scaling as opposed to launching.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, hi, Annalise. Nice to meet you, and really interesting to hear about this. And looking into Bochi's and hearing Lisa's take on the nonprofit side in the business lens, it really seems like a great opportunity in that you've got an established brand. I look at, I've got limited experience in nonprofit, but I have run a nonprofit organization. And in that time, I realized, of course, I still had to create a budget and meet it and, pay coaches and professional services. And we had to make ends meet as an organization. But, it's the same in conventional business. But it seems like what I would look at as a sub-branding opportunity, essentially, and the fact that you've got this great established brand, plus it's affiliated nationally. So the scope for having a real impact it's already in place. The potential is there. But I would, as far as the technicalities and how you separate your books is one question, but I think, looking at a bigger picture view in terms of the branding, I would get really excited in your position just at the opportunity to leverage the strength of the brand, the legacy of the brand that you've built, and to build on that. I mean, I guess the analogy I might use in the regular business world that maybe you could relate to is, Burton Snowboards. You've probably heard of these guys, right? So they wanted to reach different markets. They created several different brands to do that. Gravis Footwear was one of them. They own that, but all of a sudden they're in this footwear space that, and again, I'm making an analogy to different businesses, but in this case, it could be a whole new customer base, which is what they're after. For you, that would look like kids that are looking for career opportunities, educational opportunities. These are your customers, the people you're serving. And I think that's one of the things I'm, getting out of listening to Lisa's perspective on the nonprofit space is really there really isn't much of a difference in terms of, it's semantics, really. The people you're serving are your customers. In fact, it might serve the conventional business world well to look at their business through the nonprofit lens, because I think now you're looking at business as a whole and really having to or being called to answer the question of how are they serving the community, especially now with the COVID situation, where all of a sudden it's become really apparent, are you essential or not? That also brings me, the go-to-market strategy. Of course, now the landscape's shifting a little bit, with these new opportunities, new challenges and opportunities. So, I guess a question for Lisa too on that is, what new emerging opportunities are there in the fundraising space in terms, there's, for people to have an impact in ways that maybe they hadn't. So I guess two-part question. One, do you see any there? And the second would be, do you see a new opportunity here in that perhaps there's more interest in vocational training with the COVID situation because people are realizing they've got to be productive. Maybe they realize that all of a sudden they're not essential. Maybe they want to be. I think there's also a much bigger, and this is where also the second part of this question, Lisa, is does it help on the fundraising side to pull back and have a larger vision? I mean, sometimes you can go too big and people, blow people out of the water. But in this case, I think it's a real legitimate potential to, if it works here, why wouldn't it work at all the other BOCES organizations? And if you're pitching on that level, is that an easier pitch? I mean, perhaps there's more bureaucracy involved. Maybe you wait and go there a couple of years later.
So Chris, if I'm understanding you, that maybe, because again, I think I've been scratching my head, like this isn't like your typical revenue model. So a lot of the go-to-market strategies are about how do you create revenue ASAP, and yet maybe is revenue potential if you do steps outside the box, whether it's consulting or working with other BOCES to sort of launch their own career centers, that maybe there could be some revenue realized from that. Is that partly what you're suggesting?
I guess my assumption would be that there's not a lot of program revenue coming from students, right? So it's mostly subsidized, and that's part of the goal, I would assume, right? So I would think that there would be, what I'm fishing around for are opportunities to, who would want to support that? Who would want to make that part of their message? For whether it's a corporation or an individual, or community organization, at federal, state, or local level even. So,
Lisa, did you want to weigh in on that real quick? It looked like you wanted to.
Yeah, those are both great questions. So I think Mike and I did a podcast the other day, and we were talking about COVID and the impact. So a lot of nonprofits, and I think, Chris, to your point, a lot of essential workers, COVID is a curse economically in so many ways, but it's also a gift in certain areas. And I think this type of work and creating employment opportunities and giving, skills and trades in a contemporary setting will be so well received in this time. And there's a lot of frontline funding going on right now in this recovery space. And that's what I see this work as. So I see, if we could fast forward and you guys were ready to fundraise around this and get some grants in, I think you stand a really good shot as being funded as a recovery option to get people back to work, and particularly get people to work that might be at risk otherwise. So a lot of interest there, and I think a lot of individual interest there. I keep saying, as long as the stock market is as strong as it is, highly affluent philanthropic people are still pretty philanthropic, and this is a space a lot of people care about. Your second question is a great one. Yeah, when you go after larger grants, oftentimes they want to see scale. And so, there's definitely an attraction to being like, we've got a really franchisable model here. But I think step one is making the first version work, and making it work financially and making it work programmatically. And so I think you have to build this original one and make it sing, and understand how to fund it and understand where those funding sources are. But I think at 2 or 3 years in, if it's successful, it really lends itself to duplication. And then I think you can talk to much larger funding audiences.
Sounds like the MVP model, in the traditional sense, the most valuable, or, most valuable product, but did I say that right, Mike? Minimum viable product, sorry. Without spending too much time planning and building and all that, get it to market and see what works, and then refine it and then scale up.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. That so often, especially I think when you're not comfortable with that MVP model, people spend a lot of time hanging out waiting for it to be perfect, when sometimes you can't get to perfection unless you're beta testing. And I think there's a sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, Annalise, that this career center, it's going to have to be beta tested. Like you don't know what you don't know. And I don't know if you've got any wisdom to share as we kind of close out this particular program on what might that beta test look like, and how do you, and what is the path forward from your perspective based on kind of what you've heard today?
Well, I think that the important part for us is that sponsorship, or those partner organizations, and seeing how we can really maybe even put out some questionnaires as to how the career center can actually help the community and with those relationships. Like, is it the mechanics that need help? Is it the electricians that are looking for apprenticeships? Those types of partnerships, and trying to do a little bit of research on that aspect to see how those partnerships will both benefit us and the community at large in the long run. And then I think it's also going to be a little bit of trial and error as to what programs are the ones that are going to be most beneficial for the students. We might go in as the educators saying, oh, we need to have a computer science or some sort of digital computer programming component of the school, but maybe that's not what the community needs. And so it might be difficult for us to find those donors or the relationships from that. And so, I think that there is going to be a little bit of a trial and error, if you will, through this process as we move forward.
Cool. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. And I guess, Lisa, I'd like to let you have the last word. Any final words of wisdom for Annalise as she embarks on this next great journey?
Well, I love what you just said. Definitely do the work to make sure you're solving the right problem, at least on the employment side within the community and where the need is, because I think that in itself will lend you to much stronger funding if you know for a fact you're addressing the need. But in general, what an exciting endeavor. I can't wait to hear more, learn more. You guys do such amazing work, and I think this is just an incredible chapter that you're adding to who you are in our community and just serving us so well. So a huge amount of gratitude for all you guys do, and wish you a tremendous amount of success.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for your time and all your words of wisdom. Appreciated.
And thanks everyone for joining us on another issue of Case Studies. This is the second in a series of 3 looking at nonprofits, from launching to scaling to established nonprofits that are in a high growth phase. So we appreciate everyone's time. Again, you can reach Lisa Raleigh through Coventure. Our website is coventure.io, and you can reach me directly at mike@coventure.io. Certainly, I can also put you in touch with Chris Carroll, our SBDC consultant, if you're looking for more business skills and business coaching. But Annalise, we wish you the best, and thank you everyone for being on today's program. We'll see you around.
Thanks.